Gang Reduction Committee. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the Budget and Finance Committee, and proud to be sitting once again for the ninth time with my colleague, Councilmember Buscaino, Chair of Public Works and Gang Reduction. Mr. Buscaino.
Thank you, Mr. Krikorian, and thank you for your partnership on this critical infrastructure issue that's faced the city over the last 40 years. We're meeting today in joint session, as Mr. Krikorian alluded to, the ninth time, to address a very complex issue, and that's the embarrassing condition of our sidewalks, the most basic, important element of our transportation infrastructure. Our two policy committees have met and been collaborating on this and working together for the last year or so, and I want to recognize members of Public Works Committee, Ms. Saru, Mr. O'Farrell, Mr. Price, and Ms. Martinez. Thank you for your guidance and commitment to solving and presenting a comprehensive sidewalk repair program. Mr. Krikorian and I felt that it was important for the two of us and our staffs to put our heads together and propose a path forward that addressed as many as the concerns expressed by our colleagues, residents, businesses, property improvement districts, as well as neighborhood councils, environmental advocates, the disabled, and other stakeholders. And the letter that we submitted alongside Mr. Bonnet and Ms. Martinez contains framework that we believe is deserving of your support. It would also allow us to move quickly and with a sense of urgency by immediately dispatching city workers to repair sidewalks requested by our disabled residents, while also providing a cash rebate, an incentive for residents and businesses that proactively repair their own sidewalks. It also directs our CAO to look into accelerating this program so that we take advantage of today's low borrowing rates and low construction costs to ensure that we get the bang for our buck as it relates to this problem. It also ensures we are smart about this opportunity and leverage the $1.4 billion investment to achieve multiple benefits, such as providing job opportunities, especially to the disadvantaged workers, to city residents and underserved communities. Having worked a blessed 15 years with the LAPD and having responded to high priority radio calls and emergency calls for many, many years serving the city, we need to act today because this is a 911 call. We need to dispatch everything we can and the resources needed to fix our failing infrastructure, including our sidewalks. And the time is to act now. I want to thank Mr. Krikorian and his Budget and Finance Committee for helping us solve this problem, a problem that we've been talking about for 40 years. So let's move on this, and looking forward to sending this to council and getting our sidewalks fixed. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Chairman Buscaino. Before we go any further, do we have any general public comment cards for the Joint Committee?
Yes, we do, sir.
Thank you. Okay, so as I'm looking at these cards, these all relate to the agenda item number 1, which we will come back to in a moment. I see no general public comment cards, so unless those are among the ones that are being brought up now, then general public comment is closed. We'll be taking comment on agenda item 1 in a moment. But members, if there's no objection, I do want to note that every member of both of these committees has worked very, very hard on sidewalk policy for a long time. And a number of members of these two committees have introduced a variety of motions that have tackled parts of this problem, and several of them are before us today. We have items 2, 3, and 4, which have come out of the work of committee members here. And I would like to ask if there's no objection, since those will involve reports back, if there's no objection, I'd like to take those up as consent items. Mr. Kretz?
I'd like to pull item number 4 for a brief comment.
Okay. Any other?
Move items 2 and 3 for approval.
All right. Without objection, items 2 and 3 will be approved by the Budget and Finance Committee, by both committees on consent. Why don't we go, Mr. Buscaino, right now to Mr. Kretz's question, if we can, on number 4, because we have no cards on that matter. So if you have a comment on that, Mr. Kretz, we'll begin there.
Mr. Chair, we do have a card on 4.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, well then, I'm sorry. Just let's, if we can, hold off on that for the moment, Mr. Kretz. We'll take the cards. I want to just start off. Thank you. Before we get to agenda item 1, I want to start off by saying that this has been a problem that has been 40 years in the making. It's been several years now in the solving. There have been decades that the city has failed to act to respond to this problem. There have been many gallant efforts. They've all failed, frankly, and the city has failed its residents and its business communities by failing to address this problem. I'm really excited and I'm really pleased that these two committees have put their shoulder to the grindstone and moved policy forward in a way that has never been done in many of our lifetimes. Since the early 1970s, when we first got into this problem by assuming the responsibility for sidewalk repair based on the existence of federal funding that vanished within 2 years, we have failed since that time to maintain our responsibilities to repair or to enforce anybody else's responsibilities to repair. And the result has been the worst of all worlds. So we're turning that corner right now. And I think the proposal that you have before you, members, is going to be an important step forward for the city. It's based on your input. It's based on the input of neighborhood councils and business organizations and active transportation advocates and people throughout this city who've participated in the 9 public meetings that we've had. I'm very proud of the work product that's before you. I think it's going to be a blueprint for the next 3 generations of residents of Los Angeles and how we handle sidewalks. So I want to just go over process a little bit before we begin. We have, based on the letter that Mr. Buscaino described in his opening remarks that we've compiled, which you've had before you now for some time, we have 21 recommendations by the CLA before us. And we're going to be taking up those recommendations today jointly, these two committees. But what I would like to do, if we can, is find where we have agreement on those recommendations before we begin extensive discussion of them. So as we do when we consider the budget, for example, the rack-up of the budget, we go page by page through it. I think I'd like to do that with these recommendations, and if you have questions or concerns, we'll note them and we'll come back to them. If you don't, then the joint committees can move past that issue and we'll consider it agreed to. And then if you have written amendments or proposals, which I hope many of your comments will be in the form of written motions, please submit those to the clerk and we'll consider those as we take up each of the given recommendations. So at the end of the day, I hope that we'll be able to move all 21 of these recommendations forward to council with your amendments that are agreed to in time to be able to consider this in council within the next few weeks so that we can have this program in place in the coming fiscal year and finally get to work in fixing our sidewalks. So does that make sense procedurally to everybody? Okay. So what I'd like to do then is before we call item 1, since we can probably finish item 4 more quickly, why don't we go ahead and do that now? And I'd like to, Mr. Kretz, if I can, call the card first. So we have one speaker on item number 4. That's Bobby Pepe. Come on forward, sir.
Hi, I'm Bobby Pepe. I live in Silver Lake, and I wanted to rise in support of Councilmember Rue's, I guess it's Bloomfield and Pusiano's motion. It's a great idea to have a pilot program for permeable sidewalk products, such as was used in Echo Park around the lagoon, and it'll do a lot to stop water runoff into the ocean, and instead allowing water to go into our aquifer. And I just wanted to say a pilot program is a great way to start doing that. I'd like to see that happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, Mr. Kretz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank my colleagues for bringing this issue up. And if we use an EIR, I'd like to ask that we also look at concrete itself and the greenhouse gas emissions for concrete, indirect and direct. NASA just released a study saying that February was the hottest month on record by a significant margin. So we have to look at greenhouse gas emissions in the decisions we make every day. It's my understanding that the concrete industry accounts for around 5% of global carbon dioxide emissions worldwide. There are a number of processes that cause this, including the heating of limestone. And we can reduce emissions during the production process itself, switching from wet kilns to dry ones, and taking a number of other steps. We also should look carefully at the possible toxic heavy metals in the alternatives as well. And there's also technology that allows carbon dioxide emissions to be captured and stored. And so I just want to make sure we look at all the best practices with an eye towards greenhouse gas emissions as we go through this process.
Okay, Councilmember Rue, is that acceptable to you? Okay, and Mr. Blumenfield as the seconder. All right, well, if there's no objection to that as a friendly amendment, is there any other discussion on item number 4? Okay, is there any objection to item number 4? Okay, seeing none, item 4 is approved as amended. That brings us to item number 1. And so, members, what I'd like to do is go ahead and take public comment on this item first. Then we will move recommendations 1 through 21 and request your, and we'll call on you for your requests for special consideration of any of those recommendations. So we'll begin with public comment. And let's start with Simone Newman-Sturtevant, who will be followed by Alicia Witzling.
Good afternoon. First off, I'd like to say that I'm opposed to this policy. I am a homeowner, and it disturbs me that I see a trend in the cities across the United States where more and more services are being taken away from the city as their responsibility and put onto homeowners, yet taxes are remaining the same, so you get less services for the same amount of money. Secondly, I have heard nothing in this policy or from any talk about what is going to be done about the trees that are essentially causing the sidewalks to be messed up all around our city. There's no talk of a plan for how long it's going to be when trees are getting trimmed, when trees are getting services. Once the sidewalks are fixed, what is the plan to maintain the trees that are causing the sidewalks to be messed up? There doesn't seem to be any plan for the actual cause. It just seems to be a plan to let's fix what the problem is, but what about what the, no pun intended, root of the problem is? We met, me and fellow members of ACE met with a gentleman from Urban Forestry, and he says that 85% of their employees are at retirement age, and the city is doing nothing to hire people to care for the trees and to stop this from happening again in the future. So in 20 years from now, when the trees that are overgrown and that are causing the sidewalks to buckle are overgrown again, what is the plan? I don't hear one from the city. I hear spending billions of dollars to fix something that should have been taken care of in the first place because our taxes have not went down and the city has been receiving them and our services are being cut. And it's very disappointing. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Alicia Witzling, followed by Robert Pepe.
Hi, Alicia Witzling with LA Chamber. On behalf of the Chamber, which represents more than 1,600 organizations and 650,000 employees in the region, I want to thank you for moving ahead on a thoughtful sidewalk repair policy. The Chamber would like to share our thoughts and make a few suggestions on the recommendation. First, we support the effort to incentivize repairs for property owners that want their sidewalks repaired faster by instituting a 50% rebate program. We, though, recommend that the program be made available for 5 years. We think that it's going to be more popular than the 3 years that are being given for it, and that third-party contractors be allowed to make the repairs in a list that's not limited in terms of who's qualified. We also welcome the inclusion of commercial and industrial properties in the proposal. However, we are concerned that the capped amount of sidewalk per property will be repaired disproportionately to residents. It creates a disadvantage for more businesses that have a large footprint for their properties. Manufacturing, for example, requires a lot of physical space, and we think they would be put at a disadvantage if there was a cap. We think the 20-year warranty would be a sensible approach, but we have very non-segmented neighborhoods in Los Angeles, and we think that we should take into account the fact that we have mixed use and we have RECODE that's looking at how we change LA, and we have adaptive review. So we might want to further analyze a little bit in terms of how we do offer the warranty, and not necessarily 20 years on residential and 5 years on commercial, because our city isn't really split up that way. We also support the city in pursuing a public-private partnership. That's one of our favorite things that we see from time to time. We know it's a proven method. And we commend you for coming up with these creative solutions. We think that this is a really good step forward, and we'd like to work with you moving in the right direction continuously. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Robert Pepe, followed by John Howland.
Hi, I just wanted to say that I support the motion. I think it's very good. I want to make sure that the monies are equally distributed throughout the city, and that the central city and northeast side of the city gets its fair share of monies for this program. Our sidewalks are the oldest in the city, and from what I can tell, in the worst repair, and we may need perhaps a larger share of the monies to repair our sidewalks, especially since many of them are not anywhere near ADA compliant, unlike in newer parts of the city where most of the sidewalks are all 35, 36 inches wide or more. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is John Howland, followed by Nate Hayward.
Good afternoon. I'm John Howland with the Central City Association. CCA is pleased to see the approach you presented in your February 29th letter. It balances the need of the city while also acknowledging the responsibilities of the city. CCA applauds the proposal to incentivize proactive repairs by property owners. By allowing owners to directly contract this work and then be reimbursed by the city, it will expedite repairs and manage costs. This approach will allow more repairs to be done much faster than if the city attempted to do this work by itself. We understand the demands that heavy usage puts on sidewalks in commercial and industrial areas and are not opposed to the shorter warranty for wear and tear in those areas. However, the issue of damage caused by city-controlled trees remains. The city controls all actions a property owner may take with regard to a tree in the public right-of-way. By limiting the warranty to 5 years but requiring owners to keep trees that have previously caused sidewalk damage, the city may be placing property owners in an unfair situation. While we do not advocate haphazard tree removal, the city should consider ways that owners may replace troublesome trees at reasonable costs. There are alternatives that should be explored that will both promote the safety of pedestrians and others while encouraging and protecting the urban forest. Thank you.
Thank you. Nate will be followed by Elizabeth Hawley.
Good afternoon, council members. Nate Hayward, representing Councilmember Huizar, the 14th District. First off, I'd like to thank the chairs for their amazing work on this. I can't believe we're here, but this is very exciting. We're going to fix some sidewalks. But one thing that we really wanted to focus on is that instruction number 13, which asked the city engineer to use public and private partnerships, we add sections C and D, which basically divide the contract work equally between the zones and the various council districts, and D, that the Bureau of Engineering, as the program manager, consults with the council districts at the beginning of the fiscal year to really figure out how we distribute the, how we best manage the funds on a sidewalk basis that addresses neighborhoods and really think about, in a unique way, how we address those issues. Next thing, I would just like to say that we really think about how we're addressing our stormwater, and that we look at low cost and possible ADA compliant parkway treatments that thinks about how we creatively deal with our stormwater thing. And finally, I'd just like to say on the 50-50 program that we figure out a way to possibly prioritize applications where the whole block submits, so we best get that whole block to comply and certify it as ADA compliant, so that way we can best move through the program. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Nate. Elizabeth, followed by Jessica Meany, is it? Meaney? Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Hawley. I'm Legislative Affairs Manager at the Valley Industry and Commerce Association, or VICA. VICA represents around 400 businesses across Los Angeles. VICA supports with some amendments the recommendations outlined in the letter presented today. The sidewalk repair program is necessary for Los Angeles, but the following provisions are critical to ensure the program meets the intended goals. Firstly, tree removals that are required or recommended on public or private property should be the by right of the property owners. Secondly, the city should allocate dedicated staff responsible for overseeing the plan based on geographic areas to ensure consistency with their determinations. Thirdly, the city should create a list of pre-qualified private contractors to perform the work. Fourthly, the city should assume liability during the interim periods between a request for approval to make the improvements and the city's grant of the approval to commence the work. With these provisions, VICA supports the proposed sidewalk repair policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Jessica, welcome. Jessica will be followed by Jenny Binstock.
Good afternoon, committee members. My name is Jessica Meany from Investing in Place, also a proud resident of CD 13 and car-free in Los Angeles by choice for almost 20 years. Really passionate about this issue, really care about our most basic form of mobility, walking in LA, our sidewalks. It's really exciting to see this move forward. We support this going forward. My big picture question for you, though, is are we creating a comprehensive inventory? Can we have an inventory that really prioritizes safety? Really at the heart of this for me is about people traveling. Almost 50% of all roadway fatalities in the city of Los Angeles are people walking and bicycling. That number skyrockets in our low-income communities of color. It's really important to me that we have a solid inventory, not just at the council level, not just at 311, but something that we view as a mobility network, so truly we can leverage transportation dollars to get this done. So far, the only money I've heard from the city budget that's going to be used for this is general funds. And with the county considering a $100 billion sales tax for transportation, are we positioning our city to make sure that we can use some of that money to fix our sidewalks and accelerate this plan as outlined in your letter? But I appreciate all your work and excited to see this move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Jenny will be followed by Rudy Espinosa.
Hello, thanks. I'm Jenny Binstock. I work with Tree People, a local nonprofit organization focused on urban forestry and enhancing water capture. And we have been following this process, of course, for some time because of the tremendous implications for the urban forest, as well as the once-in-a-lifetime opportunities to upgrade our core infrastructure to be more climate resilient. So we do plan to share with your offices a more detailed letter about your letter, but we're very, very pleased to see all that's here, and we're very pleased to have all the engagement of the council offices on these important issues, particularly related to urban forestry and green infrastructure. And we feel that this letter really demonstrates that the right conversations are being had with the right units at the city around urban forestry, that UFD and CFAC are very involved, which is great, and it also demonstrates that the city is looking to ways to stretch the impact of this program. So we're really encouraged. And just a few quick comments. we wanted to encourage that the city ensures that the per parcel cap on repairs does not discourage adequate funding for innovative opportunities around protecting trees and around green infrastructure. And furthermore, another financial thing on the 20-year warranty. Woman who spoke earlier addressed this as well, but we want to encourage the city crews to not necessarily opt to remove trees just because they might cause problems within the 20-year window where the city would be liable. So addressing those things will be very important. We also want to encourage that around urban forestry, the discussions, things like tree replacement ratio are very, very important and critical to figure out. But on top of that, how is the city having very innovative conversations around how we reimagine our infrastructure to plant trees that will not cause problems in the future so we can have a robust urban canopy without a detriment to the city's wallet and to our canopy. And then lastly, we're really pleased that the city has recognized the opportunities to leverage stormwater capture. We're looking forward to working with you on that further and hearing more details about how that will actually pan out.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Rudy Espinosa, welcome. And Rudy's our last card. Any other cards on item number 1, Mr. Clerk? Okay, our last speaker on item number 1, Mr. Espinosa, welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Rudy Espinosa. I'm the Executive Director of Leadership for Urban Renewal Network. My office is in CD14, and I'm a resident of CD1. I have 2 things that I'd like to say. First, I want to applaud the leadership of the committees. This is super exciting. I'm an urban planner by training, so to think about reinvesting in our sidewalks, it's an amazing opportunity for the city. But the second thing I'd like to say and offer up is to affirm the idea that's being circulated about creating an inventory of all the different sidewalk needs in the city. As we move forward in this effort, we should think about all the different uses of the sidewalk: pedestrians, bus riders, cyclists, but then also street vendors. There's a lot of folks that use sidewalks in different ways, and we should be mindful of how we use them as these efforts and these investments come in. So thank you very much, and very excited.
Thank you, Rudy. Mr. Krikorian.
Thank you very much to all the members of the public who came and spoke today and at each of our previous 8 meetings. It's really helped to shape the direction that we're unfolding today. So members, you have before you 21 separate recommendations, which I'd like to go ahead and move all 21 at this point. And
second.
I guess we need a mover and a seconder from each committee. And then after they've been moved and seconded, we will come back and discuss whichever ones you would like to discuss. So, yes, Mr.
How do we move them before? I mean, how do we move them without having that discussion first? We're not approving them all?
Because they have to be moved before they can be discussed.
Okay.
So we don't have to
Okay.
vote on it. We're not going to vote on it.
I got you.
Yeah, we're
Gotcha.
only.
That's fine.
Okay. And
I'll second.
okay. Thank you very much. So all 21 recommendations are now before us. And why don't we just go ahead and identify which ones members would like to pull for separate consideration? How about item number 1? Okay. Mr. Blumenfield and Mr. Rue. So it looks like we'll have some. Item number 2.
No, I had item 1 as well.
Okay.
I don't think you can see.
If there's one, we'll discuss it. So I think we really only need to get the first. Anything on recommendation number 2?
Yes.
Okay. Recommendation number 3. Going once, going twice. All right. Recommendation number 4. Good. Recommendation number 5. Recommendation number 6. And number 7. Number 8. Mr. Rue? Mr. Rue and Mr. Kretz, I heard. Mr. Bonin, okay. All right, recommendation number 9. Okay, recommendation number 10. Okay, recommendation number 11. Good. Okay, recommendation number 12. recommendation 13. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry, what was your question, Mr. Rue? Uh-huh.
In his letter is asking for number 13, so do we discuss his recommendations today too, or
We can if you wish. It was my plan with Mr. Buscaino to work with his office to consider those. They're probably friendly amendments, but we haven't had a chance really to look at them yet. But I think, did Mr. Weezer withdraw that letter from the record, or is that, no? Okay. Oh, it's been resubmitted. Okay. So it's, if you would like to discuss those issues in the context of item number 13, we certainly could. Mr. Bonnet, on 13, okay. Recommendation number 14. Seeing none. Recommendation number 15. Okay, Mr. O'Farrell. Anybody else, as long as we're doing 15? Okay, everybody, it looks like, okay. I'm sorry, that was 15, right? Okay, item 16, recommendation 16. Okay, lots. Recommendation 17.
Yeah.
Okay. Recommendation 18. 19. Seeing none. Recommendation 20. Seeing none. Recommendation 21. Okay, very good.
Did someone call 21?
Huh?
Did 21 get called?
Would you like to?
Yes.
Okay, okay. Okay, very good. Now, members, were there any written amendments that? Okay, Councilmember Rue has a few here.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Those have been submitted into the record and passed out to the members.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Weezar's letter will be motion 1AA.
Okay.
Related to 13. Oh, 1.
Okay, just, not to be a stickler about protocol, but can a non-member of the committee make a motion before either of the committees? I mean, one of us can certainly do it, encompass whatever the text of it is, so we can certainly do that.
I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, good.
It'll be communication 1AA.
Okay, okay, very good. All right. So let's start then, if we can, if there's no other questions or comments, let's go ahead and start with recommendation number 1. And as we begin these recommendations, I think it might make sense if I could ask our city engineer, Gary Lee Moore, to come on forward. And is Mr. Saucedo here too? Why don't you come on forward? And then I saw Mr. Santana's here. Why don't you come to the center table, Mr. Santana, if you would? And we have all relevant staff to respond to any potential questions here in the room, members. So they are at your beck and call. So let's begin with recommendation number 1, and we'll start with Mr. Blumenfield.
First, I want to say I'm glad these recommendations include an incentive program for property owners who are willing and able to repair the sidewalks adjacent to their own properties before the city's own repair program is fully up and running. I think it's important to get that going. I had a similar incentive program in 2014 before it was decided to include commercial properties in the city program, so that's good. I have a couple of questions about the recommendations. First, given the difference between the city's repair costs and private sector repair costs, would the per square foot reimbursement effectively, could that be a potential full reimbursement in some ways because the price is cheaper, or is there any sort of check and balance on that?
Good afternoon, Gary Lee Moore, City Engineer. I think that's some of the questions we're going to be looking at. The city, for their work, pays prevailing wage. Obviously, that's not a requirement. So we'll be looking at that type of analysis and determining a per square foot cost to be able to determine what that number is.
All right, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just trying to understand the delta between our costs and the private costs and what that means in terms of the incentive program. So I guess that means we'll table that question. That's one of the things you're going to analyze.
Right.
How will the initial repairs fit with the proposed inspection program and the 20-year guarantee? Will they be eligible for the guarantee? So
our anticipation is because the work will be inspected, and then it would qualify for the 20-year guarantee.
So they do private repair. It's then guaranteed. Same process. One shot will fix it, and then, but theoretically up to 20 years.
Well, you still need to get a permit for any of the private work that's being done by a property owner. So as part of the permitting process, that sidewalk would be certified, and that certification would be a 20-year certification.
And how do we protect against bad actors, potentially, who might seek reimbursement for shoddy repairs, especially around the tree roots, that the city would then be obligated to fix a few years later? I mean, we inspect the work immediately afterwards, or how is that done?
The work would, again, a permit would still be required. We're asking that what's been recommended is that the city cover the cost of that permit, to not have that be a hindrance to have people apply for the permit. But we also had talked about creating a list of certified contractors so that they go through the kind of training that's necessary, understand the quality of work that the city's requesting, and so that property owners have a list of contractors to choose from that have been pre-qualified by the city.
Okay, and lastly, because the incentive program is fairly generous, do we have an idea of what the demand will be and how much we'll need to budget for in terms of that demand?
I mean, we'll look at the last time the cities had an incentive program to see what kind of demand was received. At the end of the day, there is a floor in terms of what we need to spend, the $31 million in aggregate for sidewalk work every year. Of course, the city could always go higher than that if it chooses to on an annual basis. And so we would have to, after a year or two of experience, we'll determine what sort of the right average is.
Is there a ceiling?
The ceiling is what your council decides to budget on an annual basis. So again, we're required to spend $31 million each year as part of the settlement. Part of that is designed for an on-demand basis for those individuals who are disabled or who know other individuals who are disabled. But the minimum that we need to spend is $31 million in aggregate.
And I think we would be coming back to you after the policy is adopted, because there's many things in the policy that we want to implement in the beginning years. So come back with a suggestion of how the allocation could be done, and within, if we stay within the 31 million, because there's many things that will be going on in parallel.
Right, like whether we would do it first come, first serve, or whether we'd sort of strategically spread it out, or how that would be done, are all, at least in my mind, open questions unless you've resolved some of those.
Now, we would have to develop the guidelines around that on an operational basis.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Rue and Ms. Martinez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a friendly amendment, and my amendment dealt with I think what you're proposing is great. The only concern I had was if we could extend the sliding scale cost sharing for commercial properties to also extend it also to nonprofits and community service organizations that can display a certain level of hardship. So should I read my amendment, or does everyone have a copy? Does it explain itself?
It's been circulated, yes.
Yeah. So if I could request the CAO with Bureau of Engineering and City Attorney to look into the feasibility of that.
Yes.
Equal to or higher.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That seemed to be fine.
I would accept that as a friendly amendment, yes. Okay, Ms. Martinez?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a question on 1A. I think that the incentive program shouldn't only assist the property owners during the first 3 years of the program, but I want to ask the CAO's office if you can look at a retroactive eligibility for the property owners who have already made repairs to their property or to their sidewalks in recent years. Can you look into that?
Yeah, we could certainly.
Because it's not their fault that we haven't gotten to sidewalks in the city.
Right.
So if in recent years they've already made the expense to repair their sidewalks, I think we should look at a retroactive way to reimburse them.
Certainly, we could develop recommendations around that and present them back to your committee and council.
Great. And I have another question, Mr. Chair, on
I'm sorry,
1B.
Ms. Martinez, before you move off that point, just one thing. If you could, when you report back, be sure to consult with the city attorney about whether or not that's legally feasible to do as well. Sorry, go right ahead.
Legally feasible to retroactively be able
apply
to reimburse
retro-
somebody?
yeah. I don't know. I just wanted to know what the city attorney says.
In all fairness, I just want to get to the folks who, within the next 3-4 years, made repairs. And then I also have another question on 1B. So the Economic Development Committee that I sit on has been discussing ways to better support our local, small, minority, and women-owned businesses. And in that spirit, I want to ask the BOE to also look in ways to ensure that the pre-qualified list of contractors specifically allows for the recruitment and inclusion of these types of businesses so that they can be part of our sidewalk repair program as well.
Absolutely.
That's, share marketplace and business preference, business inclusion programs.
That's a very
Yes,
friendly
wonderful.
I'm glad everybody liked it.
And
Anything
in
else?
addition to that, I think your committee has also established goals to reach out to underserved communities.
Certain percentage, right?
Your committee has also requested that we reach out to underserved community, youth at risk, looking at former homeless individuals, veterans.
Right, I see similar recommendations in items 13 and 20 that kind of speak to this as well.
That's right.
Right.
Thank you.
We've added into the request for qualifications, working with John Raymer, the Inspector of Public Works, actually utilizing a transitional job opportunities program. So we appreciate your support.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Martinez. Any others?
Yes,
That's
Mr.
it,
Bonin.
thank you.
Mr. Bonin, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairs, or Mr.'s Chair. A question on the incentivization. I love the idea of incentivizing proactive repairs by businesses, by homeowners. In the past, I've had business improvement districts in my district willing to completely do repairs. They wouldn't be looking for a rebate or anything like that. What they've wanted in return, rather than a rebate, is the ability to be held harmless for the work they've done. And if the work is inspected by the city, permitted by the city, accepted by the city, they say, why not? So is that something we'll be exploring as part of this?
Well, I guess the city is taking responsibility for that work in commercial areas for 5 years. So in essence, the liability, we're guaranteeing that that sidewalk will be accessible for a 5-year period if it is in fact in a commercial area. After, it would be the responsibility of the property owner. So it's not 100. I've also met with the bids who have made the similar request. It's not 100% what they asked, but I think the proposal that's laid out by the chairs of the committee lays out a process to meet them halfway there.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? Oops, sorry. Anything else on this matter, members? All right, very good. Let's move on then, if we can, to recommendation number. Oh, I'm sorry. Were there any other amendments other than those proposed by the members on this? Okay, so I guess with the written motions, for simplicity, we'll just come back to the written motions after we've completed the discussion, because some of them may relate to more than one recommendation. So we'll come back to the written motions. All right, if there's nothing further on this, we'll move on to recommendation number 2. And I think that was called first by Ms. Martinez.
Ms. Martinez.
Thank you. So I think part of the challenges that the city faces in regards to maintaining its sidewalks is having an up-to-date inventory of sidewalks and their conditions. So this is a question for you, Mr. Rosario. In your report back to the committee, can you also include a plan to develop or completing an inventory of sidewalks in our city? Can you
Sir.
include that in your report?
Yes, we'll certainly consider that, and we will report it back to you.
Okay.
Ms. Martinez, it's important to point out that as part of the settlement, we're required to demonstrate both to your council as well as to the public the state of our sidewalks on an ongoing basis. So there would be sort of a website that was envisioned that would actually show which sidewalks were inspected, which ones will be work will be done, and if it's not planned for that year, when it will be planned, so that constituents could track that on a rolling basis.
Thank you. That's it.
And just if I can add to that, because a couple of members of the public spoke to that issue too. Members might recall that a few years ago, there was a proposal before us to create a comprehensive inventory of the status of our sidewalks and repairs that were needed. And the cost estimate for doing that was $10 million. And it's a lot more complicated than, simply just sending somebody out to look at sidewalks. So it was the decision of this council at the time that rather than spending the money for an inventory, we should spend it on repairs if we're going to spend it. So to Mr. Santana's point, as we go through this program, a comprehensive inventory of the repairs will be completed. But I think that our thinking has been, don't do that before you begin the work. Do that as you do the work, so that when we're done with this, we have both indication of what's been done, indication of what is still remaining to be done, and to take it further, we are also planning to do heat mapping of where complaints have come in so that we can see where the priorities are and that sort of thing as well. So, and this will all be transparent to the public. Mr. Kretz. Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In fairness, the situation as it was being discussed was us having around $10 million to repair sidewalks, total with no program like this envisioned, and then saying, let's spend it all on inventorying our sidewalks. I think at that point it seemed kind of ridiculous. Now with a huge project like this over 20, 25, 30 years, we are obviously going to have more of a need to do that and a lot more funding under which this could come. I would encourage one of the things that was talked about at the time, which was enlisting our neighborhood councils and HOAs to do some of that work and to assist in pointing out the bigger problems in areas. And I think we may be able to do a good chunk of this with our best volunteers rather than having to pay millions in city staff. So let's not forget that as we go forward.
Mr. Chair, can I add to that? I think Mr. Koretz makes a good point. I'm happy to share my inventory, my list in my district. It's very simple. You take a picture with your phone and you add an address to it, and that tells you what sidewalk needs to get repaired.
I would say, if I can piggyback on Ms. Martinez, we have a great list to start off on what we have already. Obviously, we've been sued, hundreds of millions of dollars of payouts. We've asphalt patched a number of sidewalks across the city. We have our respective council districts that we field calls almost on a daily basis. And in addition, we know where the trip and falls have been. So a great list to begin. I understand and respect the fact that we can do more using 311 as well as using technology to identify and locate those sidewalks that are in desperate repair.
And Ms. Martinez, I think our city engineer and our director of urban forestry and Mr. Saucedo and others would probably disagree that it's as simple as taking a picture with your smartphone and that's where you need to do the repair, because there is a greater degree of complexity to prioritizing and assessing the risk, applying the elements of the Americans with Disabilities Act and many other factors. But the point with this, I think, is that as we go through this process, a portion of the assets that we are devoting to this program will be complaint driven. So we don't need a comprehensive citywide inventory to determine where to spend the complaint driven money. We just need complaints. And in that regard, I think you're right that certainly, especially with the use of technology, with the advice of our neighborhood councils and others, it will not be a complicated process to prioritize where the most complaints have come in. And I think what we're envisioning with this is that each council district will play a role in prioritizing within that council district where the complaint-driven priorities should be, and that would include presumably discussion with all of your stakeholders and the sorts of input that only a council member is uniquely suited to provide to our departments in making that assessment. Mr. Kretz.
Just one final thought on that also. I think we have the ability to go beyond just complaints with our neighborhood associations and NCs, but I think we could get people to go block by block and really identify every parcel and its condition, which ultimately I think is what you're probably getting at. I think we could get a big chunk of that done by our organization. So again, I would keep all of that in mind.
I was just going to say, we're very receptive to all the ideas and figuring out how that data could be received. Video, is it one picture and so forth. So we'll be looking how we can possibly receive outside information before the city is actually able to go out and inspect that block and so forth. So we're very receptive when we're looking at this technology to say what we've just heard here today, which is how we can receive information. But it definitely becomes complex and complicated. And when you're having a database, will the public be able to see photos that were submitted by the public? Will they be able to see only the ones that the city has been able to assess? But those are all things that we'll be considering for you, and because we understand as much information and help we can get, we welcome that.
If I could also add, I think as has been pointed out, it is a lot more complex than it appears. But as was contemplated in the settlement, and certainly the direction that your council has given, has been to go after the worst of the worst first.
Correct.
And so if you could see it from your iPhone, then it falls under the worst of the worst if it's that visibly in disrepair. And so
some of them you can see from a satellite.
From a satellite, right. So then it's helpful in informing what gets prioritized under that framework.
Okay. Anything else on this one, members? All right, very good. So that deals with number 2. We've already dealt with 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. That brings us to recommendation number 8.
Okay, Chair recognizes Mr. Rube.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For recommendation 8, I passed my amendment around as well. It's still marked 1A. It's to move to recommend for recommendation 8 to include a request for the Bureau of Street Services with the assistance from City Attorney to report back on the ability of third-party organizations like homeowners associations, BIDs, business improvement districts, or other entities to ensure and guarantee sidewalk repairs instead of property owners, including extended warranties in case where the city is unable to offer a 20-year guarantee due to the requested preservation of a problem tree. So this is just in case in my district there might be maybe an individual might not be willing, but might want to cut down a tree. But if a group gets together, whether it's the HOA or some other entity, that you look into a way where they could actually take on that responsibility, if that's possible.
That's brilliant.
I think it's a very good idea.
And definitely City Attorney needs to be consulted in that.
All right. Anything else on item number 8? Oh, yes. Sorry, we had Mr. Kretz on item number 8 as well, I think, recommendation 8. Oh, okay. Mr. Bonin, did you have on recommendation number 8, or did I get my numbers wrong? No, you're good? Okay. Anything else on recommendation 8? Okay. Then we'll go to recommendation number 9, and I think on that one, it was Mr. Kretz.
I just have a question in terms of prioritizing where the council offices fit in, because we probably have as good a sense as anyone of what the priority repairs are in our district. How do we impact that process of prioritization?
Well, I think very directly. You'll be providing the list to us. The way I read this is that we would take that list and put it into this prioritization system. It would then be rated along with the other situation. There wouldn't be a higher priority the way I read this from the council, from the chairs, that we would just go ahead and use the prioritization system.
So what you're saying is we have no role in that. We submit them along with everybody else, and it just goes into the system.
No, I think you have a major role, Councilman. I think it's very helpful because you're very aware not everybody may be submitting the worst of the worst, and I think it absolutely helps us to know where these are. And I think a couple of the criteria is like the severity of the damage, liability concerns, mobility and disability of neighbors. I think those will play large factors into it. So I think it'll be very helpful to have the input of all the council offices.
Yeah, well, just for the record, I'd like something a little stronger than that. So if we have some really serious concerns and hot spots that we get a lot of complaints about, we actually have more ability than just submitting them to actually get them done.
So if I may, just on recommendation number 8 really goes to the issue of creating the matrix of prioritizations among, no, 8. The Willits settlement and, you know what, I'm sorry. You're right. What we stated in the letter goes to that matrix. Recommendation number 9 encompasses the creation of that priority list, but then it goes to the engineering standards of, okay, now that we know what our priority list is, how do we rank within that priority list? That's how I'm reading this, the severity of the damage and the cost effectiveness. Those are engineering concerns, but the creation of the priority list is where the Willits settlement factors together with the complaint-driven system comes in creating that matrix. Is that right?
I mean, to clarify, I think there's certainly going to be enough sidewalks in the first 10 years that meet the worst of the worst categories that the departments are going to look to your offices to determine how to prioritize. And so I think the criteria that was reached in the settlement is broad to identify areas with the highest transit usage or highest pedestrian usage rather. But within that framework, there's certainly enough to go around, and as they do with other programs, they're going to be looking to your respective offices to determine how to prioritize those areas.
Mr. Chair. And then also recommendation, I guess we'll still discuss it when we come to recommendation, well, we won't be discussing, but recommendation number 12 encompasses what we stated in the letter about the 20% set aside for demand requests, complaint-driven requests. And what we're envisioning in the letter is that council offices would play a significant role in identifying where that portion of the asset of this commitment should be spent, because you hear the complaints more than anybody. And so as we do that mapping, the council offices would play a significant role in dealing with staff. And just as we do with street repair and other areas, we don't make those decisions by ourselves per se, but we work closely with the staff in determining what the highest priorities are. That's right. Mr. Bloomfield.
And just to build on Mr. Koretz's question, and I think what he's questioning is having a role for discretion by the council office. And I would add to that, as we look at this, I think that's an important role, both for the council office to have that discretion, but also to avoid some liability. What I don't want us to accidentally create is a stringent prioritization that we're going to end up getting all sorts of, Freedom of Information Act requests or CPRA requests, and then lawsuits saying that we did this street instead of this street because it didn't follow somebody's definition of what the priority. I think these are a guide, and we should set them out as a guide, but we don't want to lock ourselves into an environment where we can be sued. And frankly, we want to all, as council members, there are sometimes good reasons why we may want to tip the scale a little bit on something that is that solves multiple community problems, that may not have the biggest severity of damage, but it's in an area that serves an underserved population or something else has happened in the community, and you say, all of this aside, I want to tilt the scale a little bit for this particular sidewalk, and you don't want that to cause a legal problem. So I'll put that out there as a point, but I'll also ask it as a question if that's part of the consideration.
In the context of the settlement, the framework was established as guidelines, as you pointed out, and it was also contemplated that they would not be sequential. In other words, the number one item on the list doesn't have to be 100% completed before you go to number two. It was intended to direct investment for those sidewalks that are the most heavily utilized by people, and it's also contemplated that the repair work is not just about repairing a sidewalk in front of someone's home, but creating passageways of accessibility. So you could fix somebody's sidewalk in front of their property, but then if they can't go anywhere after that, then it doesn't really provide any value. So sometimes there'll be repair work that needs to be done from a senior citizen facility to a bus stop or a shopping center to create that passageway. So there certainly will be opportunities to consult with all of your offices on how to best prioritize all of those various areas of focus.
Anything further on this, members? I think it was clear council offices expect to have a role in this process, and those will be encompassed in your recommendations back. Yes, Ms. Martin. Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Would BOE return back to this committee on the prioritization and the scoring system that you're going to use? Will you be coming back here?
Be that we'll be giving you periodic updates, so yes, the answer in my mind was yes.
Okay.
But that would be just procedurally, Ms. Martinez, that would be after council votes on this program. Right. So we're giving them the instruction to go out and develop it, and then as that's developed, it would come back. Okay. Anything further on this? That brings us...
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I didn't call them special, but items 10 and 11, I'd like to ask that they be referred to IGTCT as they do involve the ITA agency and have the report back.
Thank you. I was actually going to recommend that. I think it would be important to have both of those matters considered by your committee. So thank you. Great. All right, and that brings us then to recommendation number 13. I'm sorry, Ms. Martinez. I have a note on number 9, but we got you on that. Okay. All right. Okay. So recommendation number 13. I have Mr. Bonin down for that.
So I had some questions on this one. I get nervous when I see recommendations that say employ private contractors. When it comes to tree trimming, for instance, I think both Mr. Koretz and I have talked in a couple budget cycles now about how dissatisfied folks have been with the work that the private outside contractors have done as opposed to the work that the city employees have done. So what are we going to do about quality control here?
The Bureau will keep oversight of all the tree-related work as it pertains to sidewalk repair, from inspections to scope of work to after post-inspection. A Bureau of Street Services tree surgeon needs to be present to ensure the quality and the preservation of the urban forest.
And is this an item that we need to do any meeting and conferring on with our labor partners?
No.
And we've been, this practice this year, we've been using the system that Nazario described, and it's been working very well with the Bureau of Street Services.
All right, thank you.
And just to clarify, all public work projects in the city are under a project labor agreement. Is that my understanding? Would this fall under the PLA?
Almost all, but just projects are under project labor agreement. But the anticipation is, yes, this will be under a project labor agreement for the sidewalk program.
Okay. Anything further on number 13? 14, we were good. That brings us to recommendation 15. And several people, I think Mr. O'Farrell started the discussion on this.
Thank you, chairs. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is my microphone on? Yeah, thank you. In relation to 15A, there's a reference to the best practices for the maintenance, excuse me, of the urban forest, including tree retention standards, et cetera. What I would request is that you pay close attention to the ordinance that is also pending in Public Works Committee on the fine structure for illegal trimming of trees. And I'll just say very briefly what I said in committee, and that is we are a city that by word values our urban canopy, but by deed not so much in terms of the wild west of tree trimming that happens across the city from, for various reasons, and the fact that there's been very little, if any, fines administratively or otherwise on companies or individuals that trim trees with no permit or out of violation with an existing permit, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is an opportunity when we talk about the urban forest for us to really place high value indeed how we feel about the urban canopy in creative ways to protect the urban canopy, to enhance it, and especially in light of rapid climate change and the urban heat island effect, et cetera. I think it's going to be affecting our neighborhoods a lot more than we realize at this moment. And so I would urge great care in paying attention to that for the instructions. Maybe we could somehow make mention of that with an amendment. And secondly, I highlighted E in terms of policies and procedures addressing the potential use of alternatives to tree removal, such as meandering sidewalks. I would like to add pliable sidewalk surfaces. I was just in Washington, D.C. for League of Cities, and they are very, very creative in their approach. I was in the Adams-Morgan neighborhood walking around for hours and kind of got lost at all the innovation that they're employing. And they're doing rubberized sidewalks around their heritage trees to preserve them. And I would like to see you look at some of the cities that are employing these alternative and innovative materials for sidewalk repair. Now's the time to do it. I think once in a lifetime, actually. So innovation is important. And then lastly, the leveraging of the opportunities that we have. I mentioned permeable surfaces, ideas and resources from other cities, other municipalities who are really making great strides in that. And I'd like to see Los Angeles become a leader in innovation at the same time. Thank you.
So on that point, Mr. O'Farrell, we're going to talk on recommendation number 16 about alternative materials and the process for that.
Terrific.
I think the pliable material recommendation you made on item recommendation 15E makes sense. Would it be consistent with what you're suggesting to broaden that and instead of saying pliable materials, just say alternative materials, because that's then encompassed in the next recommendation as well, which could include a lot of things.
I think that's a good idea, Mr. Chair. And one thing I forgot to mention is just also effective root pruning. I know that all my experiences of sidewalk replacement across the 13th District, Bureau of Street Trees and Street Services has employed root pruning to save a lot of our old trees. And so just maybe insert that term in there somewhere as well so that we don't end up with some sort of wholesale sort of removal of trees, which we don't want to see.
Okay. And Mr. Lorenzen is here too, in case anybody wants a tree-specific question answered. We have our greatest expert here in the room. Mr. Kretz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a few comments, but the first one I want to follow up on Mr. O'Farrell's concern, which is also mine. The city's going to get a lot hotter quickly. UCLA just did a study that said there's going to be 4 times the extreme heat days that we have now by 2050. And I'm very nervous that we're going to remove a number of our canopy trees. We're going to replace them with little sticks. And over the course of the next 20 or 30 years, we're going to cook ourselves. So this sidewalk program, if we replace a lot of canopy trees with new trees, could actually be an environmental disaster for us. So I think we have to look very closely at how we avoid removing those trees, moving sidewalks around, root pruning, everything we can to just uproot them and replace them. That would be the easy way, but it could be environmentally disastrous. So I don't know how much thought we've given to that so far, but I think that's probably perhaps the most important thing we need to address in this whole 30-year project.
Yes, you are 100% accurate, Councilman, and for the same reason, the Bureau has always prioritized maintaining and preserving the trees. We use every possible methodology to preserve and conserve the trees, from enlarged tree wells to meandering sidewalks. That's going to be our first priority, to maintain the urban forest and the street tree population as much as possible. By all means, inspection, previous inspection during the tree trimming work, and post-inspection will be critical to ensure that the tree population impact will be minimized.
And are we still going to have the 2-for-1 tree replacement policy in place?
That is the existing policy, and unless it changed, it will remain that way.
And the sidewalk repair program presumably would pay for those replacement trees?
Yes. That is correct.
Okay, and one last question. As part of this process, what are we doing to look at making sure the trees that we replace, the trees that we remove, are drought tolerant and disease resistant and have non-disruptive roots? Because as long as we're doing this, we want to make these the most appropriate trees that we possibly can.
Yeah, we do have a guideline, of course, to select the right tree for the right spot. I mean, LA is so big, 475 square miles. Weather-wise, we have different weather in East Valley than in the harbor. So there are different types of trees for the different types of climates here in LA. But the main concern, of course, and you're right, Councilman, is planting the right tree, at the right location. Geometry of the sidewalk also plays a very important role. How much space can we give to the tree in order for us to decide which tree is the right tree? So all those things are being considered, Councilman, and our goal will always be to plant the right tree to ensure long life at that particular location.
And we've obviously, during the drought, had a number of trees dying off in various places. So I think having them all be drought tolerant to some degree is pretty critical.
That is correct, yes.
Thank you. And Mr. O'Farrell, followed by Ms. Martinez.
116. Just kind of continuing this conversation, especially for you, Mr. Sauceda, what types of sort of alternative materials, to your knowledge, could you give some examples for sidewalk surfaces?
We've tried a few in the past, and with the leadership of our sister Bureau of Engineering, the first thing we do is we test the materials. We want to make sure that they meet the specs for durability, consistency, and more than anything for skid resistance. We don't want to put anything right there that will create bad situations or accidents, right? So once we test the different materials in the lab, what we do is we do pilot projects. We've done quite a few, from rubberized sidewalk to wrap material, recycle asphalt, you name it. We've done a lot of them, and we consistently monitor the performance of this material. So we are ready to implement a program in certain locations if the materials, of course, meet the specifications that are required by ADA and by the standards plans. And then from there, we will determine which type of material works better for the location.
Thank you. And to your knowledge, are there world cities or other U.S. cities that are really leaders in innovation for different materials for new sidewalks?
Yeah, there are some cities, especially I'm going to mention Seattle and Portland, since they have a massive amount of rain every year, they have an urgent need to collect this water and reutilize it, right? So a lot of their sidewalks are permeable sidewalks. By the way, we're just completing right now a permeable sidewalk pilot project in Council District 7. And yeah, those cities are, you can say, the leaders in the nation for the reasons that I stated. But certainly LA is not new. We've done quite a few projects in different council districts here in LA.
I'm glad to hear it, and I just hope that we think way, way, way outside the proverbial box on this, because it's like I said, it's kind of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to really do something bold and something sustainable. Thank you.
So you touched on it a little earlier, and this is a touchy subject, the removal of trees. I've had this conversation in my district since last fall when we started to do some of the sidewalk repair with our partner Lonnie, who's in the audience. But explaining to people that some of our most beautiful trees that provide amazing shade also are not conducive to the weather in the San Fernando Valley is difficult. Everyone wants that canopy tree. But they're also uprooting our sidewalks. So unless we're going to do something about the tree, I don't see how we invest on repairing sidewalks. We're going to be back there within the next 5 or 10 years dealing with the same tree that's uprooting the sidewalk. So I think we need to be very cognizant of that and be very realistic. And in the valley, we love our trees, but the point is that we have very hot summers and that these trees were planted 60, 70 years ago, and they're not conducive to the climate. So we need to, I've had these conversations in my district, and it's difficult, but we're replacing the tree, but we're not going to get back to the same sidewalk every 5 to 10 years to deal with the same tree that's uplifting the sidewalk. So let's be smart.
Yeah. Well,
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bonner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick thing. It's small, and I'm sure you'll be able to address it. I notice in the recommendation it says that instruct street services with assistance of the CAO and CLA to report back with recommendations on a number of things, including the best practices for maintenance of the urban forest. I don't see any mention made here of consultation with tree people or the Community Forest Advisory Committee. And I think it's important that when we discuss what best practices are, is that we look outside the city and talk to folks who are intimately engaged in this issue in this city and in others. And I just want to make sure that we're consulting with those two groups in particular, but probably others as well.
yeah, it is our intent, and that's an excellent point, Council Member. It's our intent to meet with all the different entities that are considered experts in this important subject. So we will be doing that to get their input and get their expertise as well, so we can develop a strategy to present to all of you in order to protect the trees and the urban forest.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else on this one, members? All right, on item number 16, the alternative materials, Mr. Blumenfield.
First up, I'm really glad to see the recommendations include proposals to use alternative materials. It's been the subject of my motion and Councilmember Rue, and that were just both approved on consent. Using these materials, especially preserve the urban forest and reduce the heat island effect, are important for the entire city, but certainly in the West Valley, where we can be 20 degrees hotter, I see that as particularly important. My staff was recently touring some of the Santa Monica alternative sidewalk materials, and a couple of issues came up that I wanted to explore here. That the types of materials used for sidewalk changes rapidly. It seems there's always something new and exciting happening. So I want to know if and how the Bureau of Engineering and Street Services plan to use the sidewalks at city facilities as testing grounds for these materials, which is something we've talked about. How are we going to do that to determine the cost, the application issues, durability, before we start recommending, the use to private property owners? What is the process we're going to do with our own sidewalks?
Councilman, I think it's always excellent to do pilot programs, and I think it's great that we do it on city facilities, lead by example, the city. As these come forward, I think it's validating them and trying them out, I think is a good way to make sure that they work before we're promoting them. So we're very supportive of doing that.
Okay, I certainly want to get that baked in as much as possible so we can lead by example. Another question about some of the materials that are used, the rubber, et cetera, one of the downsides is that they're not as durable in some cases. And I'm worried about property owners being reluctant to use them if they're getting the liability. So how do we, in the program we develop, avoid disincentivizing the use of alternative materials that may not be as durable?
I think for me, it's still an open-ended question, Councilman. I think it's part of when we come back to you, when you're looking at city-owned facilities, it's less of a challenge. When you're actually looking at the homeowner and that we're guaranteeing it for 20 years, I think those are some of the issues that we might bring back to you for consideration in the policy area. We certainly are extremely supportive of alternative materials and looking for ways, like we've all said, to the urban forest is so important to all of us. So we'll be bringing those back to you. And if there's any issues with those, we'll bring those back to you.
And again, in the context of the settlement, it was understood that that materials would evolve over time, and that's why the settlement allows for as maximum flexibility. The only requirement is that it meet the ADA standards of the time. And so in some ways the city would be establishing a new market for different kinds of materials over the 30-year period of the settlement. So there may be materials that may surface 10 years from now that none of us could think of. And the program is intended to be flexible so that we're responding to the latest, most current technologies.
I guess, as part of that, what I'm worried about is there's some things like the rubberized tiles that in Santa Monica they have, where what's great about them is the tree starts to uproot, you put them out, you grind down the root, and you slap them back down, and the maintenance cost is very low. But under our sort of current concept of you fix it once and then you turn over the liability, folks may not be interested in doing that because the maintenance on those is more frequent, although less expensive. So it may be an arrangement like that. You have to maintain it every 6 months or every year, but it's very cheap because these tiles can pop in and pop out fairly easily. So how do you stack that up compared to, well, if you just put down concrete, it may last 6 years, but you're not really, it's going to buckle and it's not going to be.
The guarantee basically addresses that, because when the city certifies the sidewalk, is going to certify with the guarantee of 20 years for residential and 5 years for commercial. So that informs sort of the kind of investment that would be made.
But isn't it a guarantee with only a one touch? So on a 20-year, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, the 20-year guarantee is really, we fix it once, it's good for 20 years. If it breaks during that time, we'll fix it one more time. We're not going to go out and fix it 10 different times. If you assume that the average tree buckles after 6 years, they get, one sidewalk breaks in 6 years, you fix it again, you're good for another 6 years. So really the 20-year is more like a 12-year in that sense. If you have these rubber tiles, it may be, you want to do something every 2 years, but it may actually be cheaper than doing the concrete over the longer period of time. So I don't know how we account for that or how we can bake that in.
I think, Councilman, for us is coming back to you with life cycle costs. I think that's part of the analysis that this council and the policy that we would bring back to, right now to do a one-time concrete repair is X. But if we want to do an alternative materials and we want to assume the maintenance for that 20 years, right, or I think those are things that we would want to come back to you about. And I don't know if there's a definitive answer today for you, right, but I think it's looking at the life cycle costs, giving this council an opportunity to consider that as alternatives.
I love the idea of doing the life cycle costs and baking that in. It's the way I understand the current trajectory of doing the one-time fix, on the 20-year thing. That's not really a life cycle cost formula, and so that formula may apply to the concrete world, but it may not apply to some of these alternative materials. So as you consider this, I want to make sure that you are baking in the life cycle cost to do that comparison, because we may have, on that 20-year guarantee, it may look very different with a rubber tile than it will with a concrete fix, where the concrete fix is the one touch, that's it. A rubber tile, maybe you get 6 touches or 8 touches, but it still may be cheaper over the life cycle.
And I would add, I think it's exciting in the marketplace to see what the vendors and manufacturers will come to us with guarantees. So I think it's exciting when they bring forth the products, as you talked about, in our testing and so forth. You know, what type of warranties are they going to be providing for us?
Right.
It'd be much more interesting if somebody comes forward saying, I'll stand behind this for 50 years. If it breaks down, I'll replace it, versus somebody who says it's good for X period of time. So I think these are things we want to bring forward to you as we continue to talk with the industry and how best to do this.
Yeah, no, that's great. That could hopefully really spur some innovation and also help us put help share the risk with the private sector in a very positive way. So I'm excited about that possibility and look forward to seeing how this, as you report back on these alternative materials, how you bake those complicated nuances into the proposal. So thank you for that.
Mr. Root?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have 3 friendly amendments that's been circulated, and this was developed in partnership with your office, Mr. Chair Buscaino, and Blumenfield's office. It's in the same lines. It's just making sure that we have more report backs and accountability. In short, the 3 amendments are: the first one is asking for a list of non-standard sustainable sidewalks design, materials, and manufacturers. The second one is asking for the departments to prepare a list of pre-qualified contractors for the sidewalk repair for use by the city or the public. And the third one is to asking the departments to create an inventory of locations suitable for the use of alternative materials. So those are the 3 friendly amendments that I wanted to add.
Any others?
This is kind of, Mr. Bonner, did you have something on this? No? Mr. Kretz? Small nuance, but it just kind of occurred to me as we were talking about this. The discussion about alternative materials has revolved around cost, as Mr. Blumenfield just talked about, environmental impacts like heat island effect, as well as stormwater issues. And I think many of us have thought about the stormwater issue only in terms of permeability, and it's just occurred to me that at some point within the next 30 years that we have this program going, this city might finally start acting on stormwater recapture in a serious way. And when we do so, the sidewalk infrastructure could actually be a vehicle to facilitate real stormwater recapture. And in that case, permeability would not be as effective as having it be non-permeable, in which case we can channel water into a particular stormwater infrastructure. So I would just ask that engineering consider that as part of the overall picture as well, and work with sanitation to the extent that that is an effective way of facilitating stormwater recapture as well. All right, anything else on this item, members? So that brings us, which one was that, 16? That was 16. Okay, so on item 17, I had Mr. Kretz on recommendation 17.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A few questions. I'm not sure if they all go under 17, but they're generally pretty similar. So I understand there's going to be a per parcel cap on spending. And what would happen if we had a green infrastructure project that might exceed the cap for a particular parcel? How would we deal with that?
Well, as it relates to the settlement itself, the settlement allows, as part of the $31 million commitment, that only that work that relates to the sidewalk itself qualifies. If there is additional work that helps meet other objectives, like, for example, work to recapture stormwater or, create green, more green spaces along the sidewalks, that would have to come from a different source of funding. So the cap itself we would frame in the same way, that it would be focused only on the sidewalk repair itself to ensure that that sidewalk is accessible. And that's where we're working creatively with the bids and with neighborhoods to determine how do you maximize this investment by bringing in other funds to enhance the walkway altogether and meet other goals.
So how easily do you compartmentalize just the sidewalk part and the green infrastructure part? Because in some cases they'll be part and parcel of the same thing.
The overall project may be connected, but in terms of the material and the work required for the sidewalk itself, that would be the only thing that would qualify for the $31 million commitment. But if there were enhancements done beyond that, then that would be added to the overall cost of that project.
And I wonder, on another subject...
Actually, before you move on from that subject, just to follow up, Mr. Kretz, I think we need to keep in mind that as important as the Willits settlement is, this policy is not about the Willits settlement.
That's correct.
This policy is about fixing our sidewalks throughout the city, which happens also to fulfill some of our obligations under that settlement. So I think to Mr. Kretz's point, the cap is not intended to facilitate allocation of funds for purposes of complying with Willits. It's intended to prevent the city's resources from being monopolized by a small number of projects that might turn out to be very high cost. We might decide as a budgetary matter to spend $60 million a year if we want to on this. So Willits is a separate issue, and I think to your point, Mr. Kretz, on additional costs for green infrastructure, like everything else, that's going to be subject to the city's budgetary process, and we would have to commit resources and prioritize those resources in the same way that we do with anything else. It may not count as an accounting matter towards the Willits settlement, but that doesn't prohibit us in any way from devoting whatever resources we determine would be appropriate to doing that. So the cap issue is a little separate. That's to prevent a big property owner or an especially expensive repair job where there's underground vaults and, so it becomes a hugely expensive project from eating up a vast amount of the resources that we could otherwise spend in fixing the sidewalks in front of 50 houses instead. Sorry.
I wonder if I could get more detail on what a green infrastructure standard plan is and how they'll be utilized.
Well, I know we have developed standard plans for infiltration along the curbs, streets, alleys. We have standard plans. I think it's once again, as we continue to look at sidewalks, is there a potential that you might want to put a pipe underneath to collect the rainwater? I think it's still to develop. We're working with the council offices to identify exactly what is the green infrastructure. I know that we have developed standard plans that we have right now in our for infrastructure infiltration along our curbs and also in alleyways.
Okay. Have we looked at the best way to deconstruct and reuse and dispose of the old sidewalk materials that we're going to be ripping up, and how best to do that? What have we done so far on that, and what are we planning?
As part of our proposed budget this year, we are contemplating the possibility of using all this concrete, taking it to one of our facilities and recycle it, crushing it, and then reutilize this material as base material, as crushed miscellaneous base in different projects that we have here in the city. So it is the issue about how do we save money, how do we recycle, and how do we reuse is part of our conversation every day. So once again, we're in the process of trying to acquire the technologies that will allow us to take the material that we are removing, crushing it, sizing it at the right, at the right size, and then reusing it every day in our daily operations. Yes.
Yeah, I'm aware of what we do with asphalt and the fact that by getting new asphalt plants, we have much greater ability to recycle. I'm not that familiar with cement. How much of our broken up sidewalks can we reuse, or can we grind the whole thing and reuse it?
As long as the material doesn't have any dirt, we can recycle every single square inch of concrete that we remove. We conducted a pilot not too long ago in the presence of the CAO, in the presence of the mayor's office, and quite a few council reps in one of our facilities where we had a vendor using one of these machines, one of these crushing machines, and the success of this operation is very palpable. I mean, you can see the material, you get the right size, and it is basically material that you can use the next day to fill trenches, to use it as base material for sidewalks, et cetera, et cetera.
And there's, I think, a worldwide shortage of the materials used to create cement. So if we're able to create it from our own sidewalks, that's obviously a huge plus.
And the amount of savings that are generated are significant. Number one, we don't have to pay landfill fees to take this material to a place to be properly disposed. Basically, we just take it to our facility, we crush it, and we reuse it again.
Okay, and I don't know if I need to speak to item 1B and 1C that I submitted. I think they're both fairly self-explanatory. Do you want me to speak to those?
It's up to you. We're going to go through them in order when we're done with this. That might be more orderly.
I'll wait for that.
Okay. Thank you. Anything else on item 17?
Good. Okay, leave Ms. Martinez on item 18, right?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And all I want to do is expand on the recommendation under 18. I think we need to establish a policy that any funds identified and utilized for green infrastructure are supplemental to the funds dedicated every year to the core obligation of the WIT settlement, as opposed to being part of the $31 million a year. I just want to make it very clear.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you. That's it.
All right. So we were good with 19. We were good with 20. That brings us to recommendation. Oh, sorry.
I want to thank both chairs and the committees for the extraordinary job, along with you gentlemen, for really putting together a piece that I think is very practical and aspirational. It does both. And especially pleased that we did include some language in there talking about small, women, minority-owned businesses and at-risk youth. We have a real network of workforce centers and business source centers. And so I like to see them referred to specifically in here. Let's start connecting these dots and direct, the activities to the workforce centers, to the business source centers, as a way of expanding, of amplifying and demonstrating that we are serious and that there are some resources that we're trying to pull together in this effort. Thank you.
I'd also like to comment on, just piggyback on Mr. Price's comments. This is something that when Mr. Cedillo was on our committee, he and I worked on finding a way to capitalize on improving our infrastructure and using our local nonprofits as well. And when we talked about forming this committee, Public Works and Gang Reduction, people are scratching their heads and saying, why gang reduction? Well, these former gang members who want to better their lives and recommit themselves to their families and their communities, provide them with a job. As we've seen at, gang intervention prevention programs like Homeboy Industries, we need to capitalize on this opportunity, LACC, and a number of other nonprofits. So really appreciate this recommendation as we move forward. And also, secondly, on 19, we've talked about a 30-year plan. We folks around the city cannot wait 30 years to fix their sidewalks. And if there's an opportunity for us to accelerate this work plan, it's something that I really appreciate Mr. Santana's efforts and this recommendation. We're trying to cut that 30 years in half. We've waited so long, 40 years of a failed policy, and really happy to see this recommendation that Mr. Krikorian and I have pushed for. Just like to see that moving forward and hearing more.
All right, thank you. That brings us finally to the final recommendation, number 21, and I have Mr. Bonin on that as the first name.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Could you explain what this means?
Maybe when I invite the city attorney.
I think that what it means, and I do have a suggested change in language, is that we will be requested to prepare all the ordinances that would allow all of the points that have been made here by the committees to go forward. In other words, I think it's kind of an all-encompassing wrap-up suggestion.
Well, I was referring to the tree root exception part.
Oh, right. I don't understand. So we are supposed to draft, well, the first problem is the way this is worded. It says, among other things, that the council will request the city attorney to repeal the tree root exception. Now, I'm not an expert on the charter, but I don't think we have the power to repeal anything the council has enacted, so I think that language ought to be changed. But the tree root exception has existed for a long time at the behest of a prior city council, and I understand this to be that we draft an ordinance repealing that exception.
Can you remind me what the tree root exception says and does?
It basically says, and I don't have it in front of me, that if a sidewalk is disrupted by the action of a tree, the city will take responsibility. A city tree, but it has not been, no one knows what trees are city trees, frankly. They're so long, that the city will take responsibility for repairing that sidewalk. And we believe that about, when Mr. Santana and I negotiated the Willis settlement, that about 75% of the damage to the sidewalks in Los Angeles is caused by trees. So that's how I understand this, but we can't repeal it. We can only prepare an ordinance for you to repeal it.
So by repealing the ordinance, then it establishes the foundation for a new program. And so the new program would be consistent with the framework that's in the rest of this, all the other recommendations, which would basically require sidewalks to be certified. The work would be done initially by the city with a 20-year guarantee for residential properties and then a 5-year guarantee for commercial. But if you don't repeal the existing ordinance, then this policy that is before you is in conflict. So you have to start by repealing the ordinance that's currently in place and replace it with the new policy that is for your consideration.
And I presume this assumes that we're not going to be planting any more trees that cause root damage or cause sidewalks to be torn up.
Well, once again, trees will be planted if needed, if the area qualifies, and the right tree will be planted. And of course, it's up to us to properly maintain the tree to avoid overgrowth and both at the canopy level and on the root system. But trees will be planted as part of a replacement on the normal replacement policy. So if we remove 2 trees will have to be replanted. So trees will be replanted.
No, I understand they're going to be replanted, but I just want to make sure we're not getting into a situation where we're absolving ourselves from responsibility and then we continue to create a problem.
Well, the sidewalk would have to be designed to ensure that it could be guaranteed for the period of time that the city's committing to, 20 years or 5 years. So if you look at the recent work that was done on Cesar Chavez in near Alvera Street, there's huge ficus trees there. Some were removed, some were not. And the sidewalk was designed to create a big enough well so that the existing ficus trees that were kept could stay there for the period of time that we're committing to. In this case, obviously, they're city-owned sidewalks because they're adjacent to Alvera Street, but each sidewalk would be designed to ensure that the sidewalk could coexist with the existing trees that remain as well as those that get planted.
Are we confident that the trees that we plant now are not trees that if we plant a new tree now, in 25 years, they're going to be buckling sidewalks?
Well, again, the recommendation is for a tree that is not going to create damage in the long run. I mean, you never know. Let's be realistic. Trees are living things, and as much as possible, what's going to determine that the area is not affected by the tree is the proper maintenance of the tree. If we let the trees grow too much, we encourage the root system to grow. And by encouraging the root system to grow, we have an opportunity there. We are creating an opportunity to damage the sidewalk. So at the end of the day, we're going to be extremely surgical as to the tree species that we're going to plant, and by providing also the right tree well size, and subsequently, the best way to keep the tree from damaging the sidewalk is by providing the right maintenance on the tree.
Okay, so I heard that there are three components. One is the type of the tree, the second is the tree well, and the third is the quality of the city's maintenance. The first thing I can feel confident of, I think. The second thing I can feel confident of. I'm not confident of the third thing at all. I mean, if we continue to maintain our trees the way we do now, which is not adequately, right, are we going to be contributing to trees that 20 years from now are going to be buckling sidewalks again?
Well, again, that would be a policy decision. How much do we want to invest in tree trimming every year? We've done a tremendous improvement in the last 2 or 3 years in terms of tree trimming, but certainly in the future we will need more resources for tree trimming than what we have today.
That's what I'm getting to make sure that we're not absolving ourselves from responsibility and then causing a problem that someone else, the resident, has to pay for 20 years down the road after the warranty is over. We need to be investing more in
That's correct.
in our urban forest and maintaining it.
Right.
All right, well, I'm not confident that that's going to happen.
We do. I think there's wide agreement that we do. I think if there's one thing that I learned from Mr. Lorenzen, though, when I raised those issues, it's that we could, if you'd have to trim trees pretty much, every few months to avoid roots from spreading. Roots in trees spread. That's what they do. But I'd like to think that we've learned something about tree planting in the last 70 years that we didn't know when the city was growing in order to avoid those challenges. And certainly with the input of some of our tree organizations that you mentioned before, Mr. Bonin, I think we can adopt a regimen for planting trees that will presumably avoid as many of those problems as we can in the first instance. That would certainly be the expectation, I think, that we would all have, rather than relying on some future council to continue to budget for tree trimming services. Solving the problem at the time of the planting, I think, is the key to this. Mr. Kretz.
Just out of curiosity, what's our current tree trimming cycle per year?
Well, our street tree population is approximately 700,000 street trees. Right now we're trimming approximately over 30,000 trees. So we're on a tree trimming cycle of approximately 18 years. Once every 18 years.
Which is actually better than it was a little while ago.
That is correct.
Substantially worse.
Significantly better, but not optimum yet.
Now, when I worked for Marvin Browdy a million years ago, or 31 to be precise, I think we were on a 7-year tree trimming cycle. What's actually the optimum, within reason? Obviously, you're not going to trim them every 6 months, but what's the reasonable optimum?
Here in LA, we have over 1,000 different species. That's what makes LA great, that you can grow a cactus tree adjacent to a pine tree. It's a great thing, and it's a curse as well, right? So with over 1,000 different species in LA, it is very difficult to determine what is the optimum tree trimming cycle for each tree. But if we were to put all the trees in LA in a blender and come up with the average tree in LA, the average tree trimming cycle should be between 5 to 7 years.
Is there any chance that we would actually get to that? Because it sounds like if we really make this program work, we should be trimming on an optimum number.
That is correct. And at one time, not too long ago, the Bureau of Street Services was trimming approximately 70,000 trees per year. That's a 10-year tree trimming cycle.
What would it cost us to get to a 7-year tree trimming cycles from where we are, roughly?
Well, right now, the tree trimming cost per tree as an average is costing the city between $150 and $200 per tree. So if we were to trim 70,000 trees per year, we're talking about approximately $14 million per year,
So,
if my math is not wrong.
and right now we're doing a little more than half that.
Yes, right now we're trimming approximately $5 million per year.
So to do this properly, we'd have to increase it, what, somewhere
That is
between
correct. We would
5
have
and
to
10
be
billion a year?
We would have to be in the neighborhood of $14 to $20 million per year for tree trimming. So we could have a tree trimming cycle of 5 to 7 years.
Thank you.
If I can, oh, Mr. Bloomfield.
Mr. Bloomfield, just on that, this tree trimming question, are we also dealing with root trimming or root pairing? Is that part of what when we talk about tree trimming, or is that a separate thing, and how important is that to the maintenance of our sidewalks and our trees?
that is separate. I'm just referring to tree trimming, not root pruning.
So in order to maintain the trees properly, do we need to do root pruning?
Well, by all means, yeah, root pruning is a critical element in order to properly maintain the sidewalk adjacent to the tree. So right now we have a line item for root pruning, but it is totally different than the line item for tree trimming.
Right, and when you talk about the cycles, is there any estimate on root pruning cycle? And because I think, the numbers we're even further, by a much further magnitude off on doing that to the satisfaction, right?
I'm sorry. I didn't
So
understand
in terms, what would be the proper amount of root pruning, per year that we would need to do, and what are we actually doing?
Well, if we take care of the tree trimming, you are basically minimizing the possible impact of the root pruning. So I think the first phase of mitigating the possible impact on the sidewalk would be to have the proper tree trimming cycle. Subsequently, and inevitably, you will have roots that will impact the adjacent sidewalk regardless of the tree trimming cycle. At this point, considering the number of species that we have in LA, once again, I couldn't give you a root pruning cycle for the average tree in LA right now. That's something that I can investigate and get back and provide this information to you as needed. Yeah.
Just, as we talk about the maintenance of the trees, I just think we need to make sure we're looking. Everybody knows about tree trimming, but most people don't think about root pruning.
Right.
But actually, root pruning has a bigger impact on our sidewalk buckling than even the tree trimming does. And so how we get the right amount of money into that, and how we deal with the deferred maintenance of that, because that's also hugely deferred, right?
Yeah, as part of the sidewalk program, and historically we perform root pruning, right? But that's very localized. Per se, we don't have a proactive root pruning cycle, and I think that's what you are referring to, right, Councilman?
Yeah.
To make sure that in the future we have in place a program that will ensure that root pruning takes place consistently and proactively, not as a result of us doing a project, right? That's what you're pretty much asking.
Or even just in a targeted way.
Right.
Some trees, who cares if they're root pruned if they're not endangering the sidewalk?
Right.
Let the roots have at it. But in the critical spots where we know it's going to happen, I just want to make sure we're being strategic about it, and we bake that into whatever money we're putting into maintenance and tree trimming. Even though tree trimming is more obvious to our constituents, and we get more immediate positive feedback from that, long term, the root pruning may have a greater bang for your dollar.
We will develop a root pruning program, a proactive root pruning program that we can attach to the tree trimming program that we're going to use for the sidewalk program. To date, our root pruning is only on locations that demand it. Let's put it this way: it's not proactive. It's just to abate or to eradicate a bad condition. But we will work together with the Bureau of Engineering and the CAO to develop a proactive root pruning plan.
I think that would lead to Mr. Bonin's issue about getting more confidence in the maintenance. if we saw that out there, that would at least allow us to express that confidence better.
I would just add that when we do replant the trees, the new trees that we're replanting, we're actually adding root barriers also to assist and mitigate for future possible damage to the sidewalks.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Mr. O'Farrell?
What we're really talking about is trees with invasive roots. And so there's an approved list of street trees for the public right-of-way, public street trees. So my question would be, in the context of this very ambitious but very badly needed sidewalk replacement program for the next 30 years, is that approved list of street trees appropriate? Is it, I'm just asking this on the spot here because of this conversation, might it be time to take another look at that list in advance of this program, since we will very likely be replacing several of the trees that must go to make way for new sidewalks, notwithstanding, the caution that we're all urging in that approach. Might it be time? And we have that approved list, and we are not, in any of the neighborhoods that I'm aware of, planting new ficus trees or new liquid amber trees and all the trees that are known for being very root invasive. Is that accurate?
Yeah, the list that we make available on our website is a current list. It's very modern. I mean, we always take the time to revise and to improve that list. Part of our conversations with the different agencies involved in arboriculture and urban forestry will be that precisely, Councilman, to analyze the existing list of recommended trees and to improve it, to either delete or add more tree species to that particular list.
And I would also like to lend my voice to checking in with our Urban Forestry Advisory Committee. There's at least 15 of them. They're appointed by the council members, and I think maybe a 16th by the mayor. And that's really important because they are sort of the knowledge base in our neighborhoods. And lastly, I think this is another opportunity to elevate for all Angelinos the importance of planting trees in one's private yard as well, because whether it's on the parkway side of the sidewalk or on the front yard side of the sidewalk, a root invasive tree is going to upend the sidewalks. So it's an opportunity for broad education of all Angelinos that are going to, I think, care about this and take some personal responsibility as the city also takes responsibility in our governance over this program. And isn't it true that you really only do root pruning when you are actually replacing sidewalks? In my experience, that's how it's been.
Well, we can always do proactive root pruning, but that's not been the practice.
Yeah, but where it's at is we're replacing the sidewalks, so that's the time to take a look at the root
That is the best time
so
to
that
do,
you're not
yes.
spending too much time. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Farrell. If I can, really appreciate this recommendation because I believe that the tree root exemption got us in this mess to begin with. And back in 73, 74, you had Mayor Tom Bradley, Mr. Piper, the CAO then, the equivalent of Mr. Nazario back in the early 70s, went and was clear to the council who made this decision, made it clear that it was a bad decision moving forward. And here we are today, 41 years later, dealing with this tree root exemption. So I'm happy to see this recommendation going forward. Mr. Koretz.
One last quick question, since the sidewalk repair is clearly going to drive a more frequent tree trimming. When we do our trimming of large trees now, do we trim every branch in the whole tree, or do we make an effort to leave some canopy on top? Because I'm also concerned that if we don't leave canopies, again, we could massively contribute to the heat island effect because we're suddenly trimming so many trees.
Right. When we trim trees, we follow the recommendations and the guidelines of the International Society of Arboriculture. Depending on the species, we will determine how much can the tree sustain in terms of tree trimming, and we follow those guidelines. I mean, it's not an arbitrary way to trim trees. We basically follow the guidelines of the ISA, which is by all means one of the highly recommended guidelines in terms of tree trimming.
Well, I'm not sure if they have an eye towards the current problem of greenhouse gases and global warming. So I would certainly encourage us to take a look at that and make sure that we try to maintain some level of canopy. Otherwise, again, we'll be cooking ourselves unnecessarily.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Councilman. And some of the species, for example, when we follow those guidelines, the guidelines will recommend not trimming more than 5%, 10%, or 15% of the existing canopy. It all gravitates around the species of the tree.
All right, members, thank you for a very efficient and thorough and thoughtful discussion of these recommendations. Don't go anywhere yet. We do have a number of written motions that have been submitted, and I think the way we should do this is have each of these, I guess we need to read these, don't we, for the sake of the record. Is that the best course? Okay, why don't we go ahead and do that. We'll start with, even though item 1A, Mr. Rue's recommendations, a number of these were already accepted as being friendly amendments. I think all of them were. Is it still necessary, do you think, to read it into the record?
I defer to the city attorney.
For purposes of clarity, that would be a good idea.
Okay. Well, we will go ahead and do that then. So we'll start with item 1A. We'll read it first, and then it's been accepted as friendly, so I don't think we need to take an additional vote, but we'll go ahead and, for the sake of the record, have it read.
Item number 1A is a communication from Councilmember Rue. Recommendation 1, incentivize proactive repairs by property owners. The parcel cap of 50% for property owners in the rebate program does not currently have flexibility to provide a higher rebate rate for nonprofits that own their property and can prove that fixing sidewalk would prove a hardship. Therefore, I move to amend recommendation number 1 to include a request that the city administrative officer, with the assistance of the Bureau of Engineering and city attorney, report back on the feasibility of instituting a sliding scale of cost sharing for commercial property owners, for example, 75%, applicable to nonprofit and community service organizations that own the property in question and can display a certain level of hardship.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr.
I move part to make it simpler.
Well, I'll leave it up to the recommendations of the city attorney on what to do on that. But for that recommendation, in any event, Mr. Buscaino and I have already both accepted as friendly. Can we just read the moving part, Mr. City Attorney? Is it?
Yes.
Okay. That'll be a break for Mr. Williams, I think.
Okay. For recommendation number 8, Councilmember Rue moves to amend recommendation number 8 to include a request for the Bureau of Street Services, with the assistance of the city attorney, to report back on the ability of third-party organizations, for example, homeowners associations, business improvement districts, etc., to ensure and guarantee sidewalk repairs instead of property owners, including extended warranties in cases where the city is unable to offer a 20-year guarantee due to the requested preservation of a quote-unquote problem tree. For recommendation number 16, utilizing non-standard sidewalk designs and materials, Councilmember Rue moves to amend recommendation number 16 to include a request that the Bureau of Engineering issue a formal request for information and develop a list of non-standard sustainable sidewalk designs, materials, and manufacturers. He also moves to amend recommendation number 16 to include a request that the Bureau of Engineering, in coordination with the development of a list of non-standard sustainable sidewalk designs, materials, and manufacturers, begin to establish a list of pre-qualified contractors for sidewalk repairs for use by the city or the public. And finally, Councilmember Rue moves to amend recommendation number 16 to include a request that the Bureau of Engineering develop categories, for example, residential, commercial, high pedestrian traffic, low pedestrian traffic adjacent to government facilities, etc., and an inventory of locations suitable to the use of alternative materials.
All right, and both of us accepted all of those as being friendly as well, so those will be considered part of the ultimate motion. That brings us to amendment or motion 1B by Mr. Kratz.
For Amendment 1B, Councilmember Koretz moves that the committees, as an amendment to recommendation number 17, instruct the Bureau of Engineering in consultation with the Bureau of Sanitation to report back on establishing low-cost and ADA-compliant green infrastructure standard plans available to the public for implementation of sidewalk repairs, and to implement these as part of sidewalk repair when it is deemed cost-effective and beneficial to the city's stormwater capture goals.
All right, and as to motion 1B, I think Mr. Buscaino and I both accept those as being friendly amendments as well. Motion 1C.
For motion 1C by Councilmember Koretz, Councilmember Koretz moves that the citywide sidewalk repair program recommendations be amended to consider diamond blade cutting as an option for addressing the city's substantial sidewalk repair needs when appropriate.
And we will accept those as friendly as well, Mr. Buscaino? Okay. That brings us then to motion 1D.
Motion 1D, submitted by Councilmember Blumenfeld, moves to instruct the Bureau of Engineering and the Bureau of Street Services to develop and implement a program to use alternative sidewalk materials at and adjacent to city facilities, including to determine their purchase, installation, and life cycle cost, issues regarding application and maintenance, and durability.
That would be a friendly amendment as well. That brings us to Amendment 1E.
1E by Councilmember Blumenfeld moves to instruct the Bureau of Engineering to report back on the estimated costs attached to each element of the sidewalk repair program, including but not limited to a cost-sharing rebate program, sidewalk inspection program.
Excuse me, Mr. Williams. I'm going to instruct the members of the audience to stay silent. We are dealing with complicated policy matters. If there's any other audible noise that distracts any of the members of this committee from their business, the person making that noise will be removed from these chambers. Mr. Williams, sorry, go ahead and continue.
Councilmember Blumenfeld moves to instruct the Bureau of Engineering to report back on the estimated costs attached to each element of the sidewalk repair program, including but not limited to a cost-sharing rebate program, sidewalk inspection program, mapping program, and warranty, as well as the potential cost associated with reducing or eliminating that element.
That also is a friendly amendment. And finally, that brings us to motion 1F.
Motion 1F is submitted by Councilmember Krikorian, who moves that the recommendation number 9D should be amended to read liability concerns and consistency with the priorities of the Vision Zero plan, with special emphasis on the high injury network.
All right, and I certainly consider that friendly. Mr. Buscaino? Yes. Okay, very good. All right, then with that, members, we have 21 recommendations that have been discussed. We have a number of motions amending those recommendations that have all been accepted. So we'd ask now for your aye vote on the recommendations as amended. The matter's been moved and seconded in both committees. Are there any objections? Any no votes? Any abstentions? I am delighted to say that seeing no objection, both committees have approved the recommendations in their entirety as amended. And with that, I want to certainly thank our members of both committees. And I also, actually, Mr. Buscaino, did you want to say something before we close?
Well, this was 40 years in the making, and I'm really proud of our committees for tackling this infrastructure issue that's been plaguing our city for decades. And I want to recognize my members, Ms. Martinez, Mr. Price, Mr. O'Farrell, Mr. Rue. Thank you for taking this on. I want to thank our respective staffs as well, Matt and Dennis, and working alongside all of our city family and those at the table. Thank you so much for moving on this. Let's get to work and let's fix our sidewalks as soon as we can. Thank you.
Indeed, I also, of course, want to thank Mr. Kress, Mr. Blumenfield, Mr. Bond, and Mr. Englander, who could not be here today, all of whom have done yeoman's work on this effort now for years, and it has produced a result. But I also want to recognize, in addition to the CAO and the CLA, the Bureau of Engineering, Street Services, the City Attorney's Office. We also have representatives here from ConAd, the Department of Disability, the Mayor's Office, and all of the other agencies that have worked so hard to get us where we are today. This is an important step, but it's not the final step. And it's going to take more concerted effort to get this done, but we are, I think, taking a very important step forward to have a policy that's going to work in the next fiscal year, and we're going to start getting sidewalks repaired. So thank you all very, very much for your hard work on this. And if there's nothing further, members, we are adjourned.